let's look at the bottom of some of these seas and see what we can do with our detective tendencies to say what happened in the past. And let's start with the bottom of the Bering Sea, as we said, is between Asia and North America. So if you look closely, you may be able to see it. Some of the indigenous peoples of America, the Native Americans and the First Nations, look a little Asian. They have dark straight hair, and their eyes and skin color often similar to those of people from China, for instance. This is not just a coincidence, it has something to do with the Ice Age. Can you believe it? People walked across and carried their genes and their morphologies and typologies and nose shape and eye shape and hair and so on. The first human beings originated in Africa. All modern people are descended from them. We have ways of figuring this out using genes and genetics, and maybe someday you will learn. If you don't know what it means, don't worry about it. Okay, more and more people are coming along in those days, so some families began to move away. First they were going to Europe and then to Asia. It took tens of thousands of years for anyone to reach the extreme East Asia in this direction. So let's say all the way to the Bering Strait's Asian edge. Very slowly, from parent to child, the appearance of human beings changed. They developed lighter skins that was handy in areas farther from the equator where the sun didn't rise as high, because a lighter skin helps your body to make enough vitamin D even with a little sunlight. So here I'm sitting in India, I'm Indian, I get a lot of sun, so my color is darker, it's brown, but that's because I got enough sun to photosynthesize vitamin D. I'm taking light and I'm producing something. That's photosynthesis as well. Africans will be darker, and if you go to higher latitudes where the sun only shows up little bit during the year, you need to desperately synthesize that vitamin D. So the skin color, melanin, can prevent those things from happening, so you end up with a lighter skin. This is a very simple story, lots of details. So Asia and America are separated by the Bering Sea. Anyone who wants to cross the sea has to sail 80 kilometers, so that's a very short distance relatively speaking. 20,000 years ago there was no need to do that, no need to sail, because back then Asia and America were attached to each other. Because of the Ice Age, lots of water had stored in the ice caps. So much water, in fact, that the sea level all over the entire world was 120 meters lower than it is today. You keep evaporating from the ocean, converting it into snow and putting it on land. You're moving water, lots of water. Imagine building several kilometer thick glacier. That's a lot of water, which means the ocean keeps going down, and that means there is an ocean bottom between Asia and America, which is going to provide a continuous land link if the water goes below that level, right? So it's a fairly shallow level as well. So if you lower the sea level on average by 120 meters, you definitely are going to expose many of the lands that are under the ocean. Now, people who arrived in America lived for thousands of years on what is now the bottom of the sea. Let's hope they made a fire or two, because it was really, really cold when the ice began to melt. Some groups moved on and populated the north of the North America, the area we now call as Canada. Others went south to what is now the United States. They settled in different areas, but they were the first people to call North America home. We keep thinking about Christopher Columbus, 1492, the age of discovery and so on and so forth, but alas, people were there well before Columbus was even aware of this land. When these human beings came to America, they encountered all kinds of big animals like the giant beaver, the cave lion, the saber-toothed tiger, the dire wolf, the mammoth, and the megatherium. a ground sloth that was the size of an elephant. Megatherium. Most of these giant animals had been living there for millions of years. They had never seen a human being before. A few thousand years later, all the giant animals in the North and South American continent were extinct. Was that because humans hunted them? Well, that's what evidence suggests. Okay, so here we are. This is saying see you in 69. That's a song that you don't know about maybe. Here is the Bering Sea on this side, the North Pacific here. Bering Strait is coming through here from the Arctic into the Bering Sea, and here are some primates and a koala and a kangaroo and a coral seas. Here we will look at in a minute, and all kinds of fish and rays, and the penguin sitting happily down in the south, a whale, a dolphin, a saber-toothed tiger, and a mammoth. And this is some kind of an animal that I should know, but unfortunately I don't know. Something that's specific to South America, I suppose, but that's now because things would have moved across the land bridges all over the place. If you drop the sea level by 120 meters, you would have had walkways all the way from Africa into India into Australia, right? So let's read what's at the bottom of the Coral Sea before we jump to the next podcast. So here we are, Coral Sea on this side, Australia, Indonesia, Sumatra, Java, and Bali, and you could have just sauntered across here because the sea level was gone and the bottom was a highway you could walk on. No cars, no boats, no nothing. The biggest coral reef in the world is in the Coral Sea of Northeast Australia. This reef is made entirely of coral organisms and it's called the Great Barrier Reef. In total, the reef is about 2,600 kilometers long. It's made up of 900 islands and lots of reefs, all of which are just under the water surface because that's how corals grow. There are large numbers of colorful fish and other creatures swimming around in the sea there, a lot like Nemo and Dory if you see in movies like Finding Nemo and so on, but with smaller eyes, not as big as Nemo and Dory, not as many friends, and way more boring lives than the movies make them to be. Climate change is a huge threat to the Great Barrier Reef even now. Waters are warming, more CO2 is dissolving, which means it's becoming more acidic, as we've discussed before elsewhere. But we'll get to that later. Climate change was also responsible for the creation of the reef, as scientists have only recently discovered. The original inhabitants of the region, the Aboriginals, had known about it for a long time though. Like the first Americans, the Aboriginals were able to make the crossing from Asia thanks to the Ice Age. Nowadays, you would need something like a ferry or an airplane. But back then, the water of the sea was so low that nearly all the islands of Indonesia were attached to one another. Now you have some 23,000 islands here, but now take the water away and they are all just one landmass, right? The Aboriginals could walk from Sumatra to Java to Bali. There were just a few deeper spots where they must have used boats to get along all the way to Australia. We don't know, but we must imagine these things. We know sea level change, we know the depth of the ocean, and we say this would not have gone all the way to the bottom. There would have been a sea and it's too far to swim, so they must have used some boats. It's a detective work. They arrived there about 50,000 years ago. The Aboriginals spread out across Australia. The Yidinji people went to live on the coast of the Coral Sea over here, where at that time there was no coral at all. They lived there for tens of thousands of years on a large plain beside the sea. They collected shells from among the rocks, caught fish in the sea, and hunted water birds in the forests on the coast. We know from digging up the sites and looking at digested food and bones and other things, and we put together these kinds of stories. What's fascinating is that the Aboriginals of today still know the stories of their distant ancestors from a long time ago, because The parents tell the kids, kids tell their kids, and so on and so forth. The older people pass on the stories to their children and grandchildren in the form of a dance and kind of a song. One of these dances tells the story of Gunia and the sacred fish. Gunia goes fishing with his spear. Here's Gunia, and going and then facing a big stingray like thing here. He throws the spear at a sparkle in the water, which could be fish eye, but oh no, it turns out to be a whiptail stingray, their sacred fish. The fish becomes angry and rises up and thrashing about and setting the sea in motion so that the water rises higher and higher. That's how the Aboriginals tell the story of the rise of the sea level, a story that is completely in line with this latest scientific research. So they have coded the stories of what they saw in sea level change into a story that they can tell their children, grandchildren, and so on. But you go back and see when the story originated, and then you look at the scientific evidence and say, aha, that's when the sea level rose. So this story of a big stingray thrashing around is corresponding to the rise in sea level, melting of the glaciers, and so on. Well, okay, except for the bit about the angry fish, but around 14,000 years ago, the water did indeed begin to rise as the last cold ice age began to end. It was the end of the ice age, and the ice caps were melting. All that water locked up on land was coming back into the sea. The plain where the Indigi lived gradually became covered with water. The land turned into swamp, the swamp turned into sea, and the little hills turned into islands. Where there had once been a plain, there was now a warm, shallow sea, the coral sea. It was the perfect place for a big coral reef to grow, because in a shallow sea the sun can reach all the way to the bottom, and the algae in the coral need sunlight to grow. That was how, over the course of a few thousand years, the largest living construction on Earth was created, the Great Barrier Reef. Remember, it's 26,000 kilometers, right? 2600 kilometers long, and it's a living thing. Coral polyp grows, and it's an animal that builds calcium shell, builds a building, so algae can come live on them, and then algae take out the CO2, produce oxygen for the coral, and other fish come and they live happily there, and we go snorkeling and diving to see the fish, and so on and so forth. So we'll come back and look at the bottom of the North Sea to tell some other stories from the Atlantic Ocean. See you in the next podcast. I have to run now and go meet some friends for lunch. You go have lunch or whatever time it is, and I will see you in the next podcast. Okay, children?